Hey, welcome back. Today we will be looking at all the melee armors that are easily accessible. Now, initially I was just going to do the sword armors, but considering there's only like 4 of them, I figured I'd just combine the lances and the axes too. And while it's not exactly a big amount, it's still quite a bit, so I figured I'd just make this one of the shorter videos and go into the armors. Now, I do have to preface this immediately by saying most armors can't really work on a budget, especially nowadays because of how the meta has shifted. So we're going to get rid of the cost rating entirely, and rather than having a budget build, I figured we're just going to make 2 applicable meta-defining builds for each of the characters. Again, mainly because fighter skills aren't budget, and we don't really have a lot of options for armors on budget, at least most of them. So I don't think it's really worth trying to salvage something with just giving everybody quick riposte and that's about it. So with this one, it's going to be a bit different this time around. So hopefully you still enjoy. We are still going to keep the performance rating though, because that doesn't really have to change just because there aren't any budget builds. But it's never really been like that anyway. But in any case, we may as well just get started immediately with the sword armors, starting with Arden. Arden is probably one of the best near save armors in the game simply because of the fact that he has dual phase brave and a stupid amount of HP, good attack, and really solid defense. His dump stats are easily his speed and res at 16 each respectively, so you don't really have to worry about a lot of threats if you're making him near save because he can take a majority of them with his defense. He will still have to worry about dragons, but as long as you can keep him above 50% HP, he should be good to go. His weapon doesn't grant any res, but that's fine. You could always patch it out with something like defense res near save and close defense 4, which isn't the worst. It does help on light season, but outside of that, you're not really going to see too much mileage with his res. So you're better off really just investing into his attack and defense. For the 2 builds, I do actually have a far save and a near save for this one, even though I did say his res isn't exactly great. For his near save build, I have Arden's Blade with Ignis, Steady Breath, Attack Defense 4, and Attack Defense near save. Basically, you're stacking up as much attack and defense as possible so his Ignis can do a ridiculous amount of damage. And with Steady Breath, he should be able to trigger his special on every second hit, provided that there aren't any guard effects. But with Follow-Up Ring or any sort of enemy phase fighter skill, he will be able to trigger Ignis no matter what, so long as Steady Breath is active, which is really, really nice. And then for as far as I build, I figured you may as well just make him a Vantage unit. As far as Vantage units are concerned, he isn't exactly one of the better ones. He is good because he does have dual phase brave, which means he can attack twice in the enemy phase. But because he has that 50% HP condition, it's going to be a bit tougher to maintain it, especially if he has to set up against a mage, which can be difficult. And because of the fact that his defense is pretty high, it may be harder to set up against a unit that targets his defense. So it's kind of a double whammy for a lot of cases. It works, but it is going to be a bit difficult for him to set up. Even so, it does do the job. He could still get a fair amount of attack out. Moonbow is probably going to do a good amount of damage, and with attack, defense, far save, and steady breath, he should be able to output a fair amount of damage. Still, his best performance is definitely going to come from him being as a near save, and honestly, he is one of the best near saves that we do have in the game, which is really surprising because he's one of the most accessible units that we have in the game, thanks to Grails. With that being said, I do think a 9 out of 10 is really good. He's not perfect by any means, but he does the job really, really well. And outside of dragons kind of messing him up, he's going to be doing a really, really solid chunk of damage and tanking. So you can't really go wrong with building Arden if you need a near save. Next, we have the Black Knight, who is also a really, really solid sword armor. He has a distant counter weapon with Slaying that grants Spectrum 4 if his HP is above 25% or more. He has 48 HP, which is pretty good. He has 34 attack speed, which can be great for Savvy, and 35 defense, which is not bad for tanking in general. His dump stat's easily going to be his res at base 18, but with Savvy, he shouldn't really struggle to take a fair amount of damage against dragons. He will still take quite a bit from blue dragons, but outside of that, he should be able to mitigate a lot of the damage he's taking from magical threats in general, just because of the fact that he does have access to Savvy Fighter, which is the first build we are going to recommend, actually. Basically, you're going to be speed stacking him and attack stacking him as much as possible, so that way he can not only act as a defensive null follow-up user, but he also gets damage reduction, meaning that his survivability is actually going to be really, really high. He doesn't have the same level of physical bulk as Arden does, but his matchups against dragons are significantly better, which actually makes him a lot more flexible in compositions, especially against dragons, which is not bad at all. You could make the argument that Arden is better simply because of the fact that he does have natural bulk, which I do agree with. His natural bulk is going to be way better in the long term, but for what it's worth, having the ability to take on any sort of melee threat is a boon to have. Of course, you could also make Black Knight into a hardy fighter distant defense tank, but this is mainly for summoner duels purposes more than anything else. For anywhere else, you may as well just keep Black Luna, but in summoner duels, you could just run distant defense with hardy fighter and darting breath. Basically, what you would want to do is tank as much as possible, and that is definitely the goal with summoner duels, because unlike Aether Raids, this isn't a turn-based thing, it's an action-based system, meaning that a unit can't simply just go in and deal damage, because they may leave their unit prone to death, which is a problem. So having a general tank with a DC weapon and a slaying weapon is pretty good. You could also swap out Darting Breath with Deflect Magic if you're going up against brave units like Ninja Korin and Reinhardt, for example, but with Darting Breath, he shouldn't struggle to charge up Aegis again, especially against units that have guaranteed follow-up attacks. But that actually gets disabled by Hardy Fighter anyway, so it's not like it matters. But in any case, I think Black Knight is actually on par, if not pretty similar to Arden in a lot of cases. Arden does have better natural bulk, which means his overall performance against melee units are going to be significantly better. But Black Knight does have better matchups against dragons, which I do think isn't something you should write off, especially since their bulk is fairly similar. Arden does have a lot more HP and a good amount more defense, but damage reduction combined with Black Luna means that his damage output's also going to be really significantly high. And for that, I also think he's definitely a 9 out of 10. Next, we have Draug, who's in an unfortunate state of just having really stiff competition, even if it's just 2 units. He can be a decent savvy unit, even though 32 speed isn't exactly the highest, but it's still more than manageable, especially with a speed-refined weapon. His PRF is basically Carrot Cudgel that also inflicts -6 attack if the foe initiates combat, so his bulk isn't bad at all. He has high HP at 50 base and 39 defense, which is really good. His attack is definitely on the lower side, but can be patched up with his PRF. Even still, 30 base attack with a 21 might weapon isn't exactly doing a lot against a lot of units unless he's reliably triggering Ignis, for example. I will say his biggest benefit is just being easily accessible, because he's the only red armor that's accessible through the normal pool, but all the other red armors are through Grails, so there's not really much you can do there. If you want to use him as a near save, honestly you could either just stack up his attack and defense, or you could stack up his speed. Regardless, you're going to be using Ignis spamming on both cases. The only difference is that one comes with Crafty and the other one comes with Savvy. For the first one, you're mainly stacking up his best stats and the stats that matter more, in my opinion. So with Stalwart Sword and an attack boon, he's actually making up for a good amount of his deficit, which isn't bad at all. And then for the second build, you're stacking double attack defense unity, so you're basically stacking all 3 stats with the speed refined Darting Breath. He hits 49 speed, which is fine, at least before support. So I wouldn't really write that off either. But as a near save unit, he still competes with the Black Knight and Arden. And to be completely honest, I will say that their performance is significantly more impressive than Draug's, and I can't confidently give him anything above a 6.5. This isn't to say he's bad, because at the end of the day, most armors aren't going to be really good simply because saves are really ridiculous in this meta. A Gen 1 unit like Draug can perform in a Gen 6 meta currently just because of the fact that he has access to that skill. So, for what it's worth, he's still a decent unit. It's just that he competes with Black Knight and Arden. And then for the last sword armor, we have Zephiel, who comes with a threatened defense, distant defense weapon, which is really interesting, I guess. I mean, I don't remember it being great to begin with, but it's a weapon. It's a weapon. His stat line is actually really good at 55 HP, 35 attack, and 38 defense. His dump stat's easily his speed, and his res isn't actually that bad at 24, but it's definitely not anything impressive. If you want to use him as a near save, you could honestly go with a Winter Rapier or Vengeful Fighter Ignis set. This is just to stack up his best stats and make him a complete wall. So you don't actually have to run Steady Breath for this one. You can keep stacking attack and defense with Form, Sturdy Stance, Vengeful Fighter. Vengeful Fighter is definitely one of the more interesting fighter skills that we have. It's not exactly an amazing skill nowadays, but the fact that it can still grant accelerated cooldown on his hit as long as the foe initiates combat can actually work in his favor, especially since the foes are going to be doubling anyway, so it doesn't really matter all too much. And 50% is going to be fine, especially since that he's not really going to be taking damage a lot of the time unless it's from a dragon. And then for another near save build, I figured this would be a really cool idea where basically you kind of turn him into this like weird fallen Edelgard sort of thing where it's like you have wary fighter with slaying and near save. So every time the foe initiates combat, he triggers bonfire as long as there isn't guard. And then sturdy stance 3 is just, it's basically a mimic build, but like it's not bad. If you just want to rely on one-shots and mitigate the amount of damage you're taking in general, it's not the worst. I just worry about his overall damage output, but there really isn't much else that you can do with him beyond just stacking attack and defense and near save, and that's pretty much it. I figured this would just be an interesting approach. Even so, I will say he's also in line with Draug in a sense. I would have said he's better just because he has better stats overall, but Draug can run Savvy Fighter, which is a boon to have, which is why I am willing to also give him a 6.5. The competition is really, really stiff, and if you're going to spend grails on any sword armor, it either should be the Black Knight or Arden, in my opinion. Then we move on to the Lance armor, starting with Benny, who's probably one of the best generic Lance armors that we have in the game, simply because his stat line is super min-maxed. He has 48 HP and 35 attack, which is pretty good, but 44 defense and 34 res, which actually is really, really, really solid, especially that defense stat. He comes with a lance that grants attack defense 5 and neutralizes the penalties to attack and defense during combat, which isn't bad at all, especially if you want to use him as budget as possible. If you want to use him as a near save, I highly recommend giving him Courtly Candle, which is actually really, really good for the Lance armors, which is something I do think they have over all the other ones, simply because damage reduction is really, really good. You could stack double close defense and have him just generally tank against all sorts of units. You could give him Crafty Fighter with Bonfire, and he should be able to output a fair amount of damage. Obviously, it's not going to hit as hard as Ignis will, but he should still be able to kill or tank really, really well. If he's not killing, there's a good chance he's not even dying in retaliation anyway, so I wouldn't really worry about it all too much. Of course, you could also use him in summoner duels with Spirited Spear, Hardy Fighter, Deflect Melee. The idea here is that if he has a bonus, he will be able to recharge Sacred Cowl on the second enemy hit, which isn't bad at all. And then with Distant Defense 4 and Deflect Magic, he should not be taking a lot of damage whatsoever. And honestly, as far as generics go, I do think that Benny is probably one of the best Lance armors that we have in terms of generics, which is why I'm going to give him a 7.5. Access to Courtly in Stout Lance is what sets him apart from a lot of the other armors, in my opinion. Next, we have Effie, who's definitely one of the weirder armors we have. She has a lot of HP and attack, but her defenses aren't exactly the best. But she is getting a Resplendent soon, so her 33 defense is actually going to become 35, which isn't bad at all. It's not the best, but it's still not bad at all. Her Refine isn't good. I'll just leave it at that. But it's a good thing she has access to all the other lances, so we don't really have to worry about her PRF all too much. I figured this time around we may as well just use a player phase build because her attack stat is really, really high, but we also have a near save build anyway. With Slang Lance, Slick Fighter, Sturdy Stance, and Steady Breath, the idea here is that her damage output's just going to be really, really high because she can trigger Bonfire in every hit as long as the foe initiates combat, and she should not struggle to kill whatsoever because 64 attack with a Bonfire is it's going to be really, really strong. Of course, you could actually just make her a Gale Force unit with Stride and Bold Fighter and Death Blow, so her damage output's going to be really significant. She really shouldn't struggle to kill on 2 hits unless you're going up against a really, really bulky Axe unit, but even with that being the case, Death Blow 4 granting 8 attack, and then whatever support she may get from other skills and units should allow her to output a fair amount of damage, which is why I do think she is honestly a pretty good user of a Brave Lance Bold Fighter set. Overall though, I do think she's not exactly better than Benny, which is why I'm going to give her a 7 out of 10, but she does have access to all of these really, really amazing lances, which is why I'm not going to give her a 6.5 either. Defensively, she's not exactly better than Zephiel, for example, but she does have access to a lot of better weaponry, which is why I do think her performance is going to be a lot better. Winter Rapier is still a really good weapon, for sure, but I do think access to Courtly Candle and Stout Lance and all the other lances is going to set them apart quite a bit. Next we have Valentine Ellwood, who's a really cool armor actually. He has a lot of attack at 38, he has 32 speed, which is fine enough for Savvy in my opinion, especially if you do a speed refined weapon. His bulk actually isn't that great, but he can make up for his bulk with Savvy Fighter. I will say if it weren't for Savvy Fighter, he actually wouldn't really be that great of an armor simply because of the fact that his bulk isn't really that good, even with max merges and investment. You can stack up his attack and defense if you really want to, but I feel like speed stacking is going to be the way to go here. Which is why I give him Springy Lance with Kestrel, Savvy, and Darting Breath. Basically, you're just going to be relying on damage reduction a lot of the time, which isn't the worst thing you can do, especially since it comes with no follow-up in the skill, which is really good because there's a good chance he's not going to get doubled as a result. So 36 defense res is a bit shaky, but with Savvy Fighter, he should make up for that. And then, of course, if you really want to, I did also give him a Armor Stride set with Ninja Naginata simply because he does have a really good attack stat at 38, so I don't think it's going to be a problem if he runs this. And then with Daring Fighter, Daring Fighter isn't exactly like the best fighter skill, but it could work for him simply because it does come with Player Phase No Follow-Up and Desperation, so he can quad in a lot of instances. It will just require that he's able to survive a retaliation, because 32 defense isn't really going to be doing quite a lot for him. Even so, I do think his performance is pretty good, especially with Savvy, which is why I do think a 7 out of 10 is pretty fair. His bulk isn't exactly the best, but again, with Savvy, it should make up for that. And his attack and damage output should be pretty good overall. Next, we have Gwendolyn, who's not really that bad of a unit. She has a slaying weapon that grants accelerated cooldown per foe's attack and defense res +4 for HPs above 50%. She has 49 HP with 38 defense, which is pretty good physically. 28 res isn't bad at all. 30 attack isn't great, but it's not bad for her simply because, again, she does have access to a lot of good skills and inheritable, so I don't think it's going to be as bad as someone like Draug just because she has access to all those skills. If you want to use her as near save, I do recommend pretty much the same thing. You're stacking up her defense and attack as much as possible. The great thing about Gwendy is that with her weapon, she doesn't actually need steady breath because she does get accelerated cooldown per foe's attack, so she can continue to stack up attack and defense as much as she wants. Of course, you could also use this in a Summoner Duelist context with Distant Defense 4 and Deflect Magic. She won't actually need breath for this because, again, it works off the foe's attack, so she can actually make for a really good ranged tank there. And for that reason, I'm also willing to give her a 7 out of 10. I feel like the Lance armors are best off out of the three, just because, again, they have access to all these really good skills and lances and whatnot. And the PRF isn't exactly the worst. Her attack isn't exactly the best, but if you want her to survive, she can absolutely do that. Next, we have Valbar, who actually isn't too bad whatsoever. I'm pretty much going to say that for a lot of the armors because they're armors with min-max stat lines. He has 49 HP and 38 defense, which is pretty good physically. 35 attack is more than respectable. 26 res is not bad at all. 25 speed could be lower, but it's probably going to be your best dump stat there. For Valbar, you can pretty much do the same Courtly Candle set with attack defense unity, attack defense form. Basically, you could stack up his attack and defense as much as possible because that's pretty much what you want to do with near save armors a lot of the time, unless they do have workable res like Benny does, in which case you could stack up close defense. But with Bonfire Courtly Candle, he shouldn't really be taking a lot of damage at all. Of course, you could also make him a weird Gwendolyn in a sense, where you run Spirited Spear but with Sacred Cow instead. I don't think it's nearly as good simply because it doesn't have slaying, but it's still not bad at all if you really just want him to tank in Summoner Duels. It does the job. Still, min-max star, not necessarily min-max, but he does have a good stat allocation with really good inheritable, so I also think a 7 out of 10 is also going to be fair. He's not Benny levels of min-max, which is why I do think Benny is better overall. But as an armor with access to Courtly and Stout and all this jazz, again, I know I keep repeating that, but I think it's fair to highlight. He's going to be doing quite well, in my opinion. Then, finally, we have the Axe armor, starting with Halloween Dorcas, who's a really min-maxed armor. He has really high attack at 41 base, he has 37 defense and 29 HP, which is really good defensively. 21 res isn't exactly that great, and 25 speed, again, could be lower. But as a physical wall, he's going to be doing really well, especially with his damage output. If you want to just make him into a physical wall, honestly, you could go with a Wogun set with Noontime Attack Defense, Ideal, and Steady Breath. The idea here is just to keep him as healthy as possible so you can get the max amount of stats from Attack and Defense Ideal, which shouldn't be hard to do, especially since he does have a lot of attack, he has a lot of defense. He really shouldn't be struggling to tank physical hits whatsoever. But if he comes across a dragon, that will probably prove an issue, because 28 res at that max investment is not going to be doing too well for him. And of course, he does have really, really high attacks, so you could also do the same thing as you did with Effie earlier, with a Gale Force set with Bold Fighter, Armor Stride, Quicken Pulse, and Brave Axe. He really shouldn't be struggling to output damage, but if he can't kill on the first 2 hits, he still has access to the other 2, provided that the foe doesn't disable them, because Bold Fighter will allow him to attack 4 times. Still, he's basically another Effie. He doesn't have the same inheritables as she does, but his bulk is significantly better, and his stat line is definitely much more impressive, which is why I do think a 7 out of 10 is fair for him. A lot of these units are pretty good. There's only a few exceptions just because of the fact that they were probably Gen 1 with really mediocre refines and really poor stat lines, but beyond that, most of the armors are pretty good. Next we have Flame Emperor, who's pretty much the same as Halloween Dorcas in a lot of sense. Their stat line is really similar. The only difference is that there's like 1 point of attack and HP and then maybe res, and that's about it. Beyond that, they're pretty much the same. They even come with the same weapon, Guard Axe, which is really funny if you think about it, because it's basically just another copy-paste but with extra BST for scoring. Same thing as earlier, if you want to use them as a near save unit, you could honestly just stack up attack and defense as much as possible, so their bonfire procs are going to hit really, really hard. So Sturdy Stance 3 Slick Fighter near save is going to be doing you quite well, especially with breath, so they can consistently trigger bonfire. Of course, you could also run an Aether set with Spirited Axe and double close defense, so this way they can act as a more general tank, especially against dragons. Dragons will hurt a bit because 33 res isn't exactly the highest, but with Spirited Axe granting accelerated cooldown on the foe's hit, as long as they are able to double and the foe is able to double, they will be able to trigger Aether on every second hit. But again, because Flame Emperor is basically another Halloween Dorcas, a 7 out of 10 seems more than fair. I figured they'd differentiate the stat line a bit more, but maybe with a refine in the future, Flame Emperor will actually be a bit different. And then last on our list, we have Sheena, who has a Slang Attack Defense 5 Guard Axe, which isn't bad at all. Her stat line isn't exactly good either. She basically has the Draug stat line, except rather than having a workable speed stat, she has a decent res stat at 33. Her attack at 30 base isn't really good, 45 HP is good, 36 defense is good. She's not really going to struggle to take on physical foes whatsoever, so it's not really the worst there. You could just make her into a general tank with close defense 4, defense res near save, and slick fighter. She already has guard in her weapon, so she doesn't really need sturdy stance 3 or any sort of stance, so it's not bad there. Of course, you could also use her in summoner duels with Crimson Axe and Sacred Cowl. As mentioned earlier, the idea here is just mainly to tank as much as possible, so she doesn't die immediately and then you can take out the foe, or they can't approach her, which is really, really nice. The guard in her weapon can actually come in handy, especially against lethality users that put it at 1 cooldown, which isn't too bad at all, especially with Flash of Steel weeks. I don't remember if it grants null guard. I don't think it does, but it should be fine nonetheless. Still, as a unit, I do think you do have better options in Dorcas and Flame Emperor. Sure, Crimson Axe isn't exactly the worst for summoner duels, but I do think that with the difference in inheritable weapons on top of the really mediocre stat line, I don't think she's exactly going to be doing a lot better than someone like Halloween Dorcas, for example. Of course, different roles, different niches. I would have given her a 6.5, but I do think, comparatively, Zephiel does have a better overall stat line, and Draug does have access to Savvy Fighter, which you can't really do with Sheena, which is why I do think that maybe a 6 out of 10 is fine, but maybe I'm being a bit harsh. But at the end of the day, these are armors, and no matter what, they're going to be good, so I wouldn't really worry about that. Still, that's pretty much it for the armor video. You'll have to let me know what you think down below, because I'm curious on your overall thoughts. I don't know if this was the right approach, simply because you can't really do a lot with armors on budget, so I figured just recommending save builds would probably be the way to go. But still, just let me know your thoughts, I'm curious. In any case, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.